In this episode, I'm joined once again by writer and theorist David Skrbina. In this episode, we discuss Ted Kaczynski's book, Anti-Tech Revolution, Why and How. I'd like to wish all listeners a happy new year, and I'd also like to thank all those who have supported Hermitix throughout 2021. And if you would like to support the podcast and keep it going indefinitely, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, I hope all of you have a great 2022, and please enjoy. So, David Skrbina, thanks very much for joining us once again on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
So this time we're not discussing panpsychism again. We're actually discussing the other sort of side. I don't want to split your work into two clear sides. I mean, there's more going on, right? But the two sides to your work. The one side that maybe more people, maybe more people know you for is your work on technology, and specifically sort of anti-technological or tech-critical philosophy, and also specifically around I say thinker that we're talking about today, Ted Kaczynski, or Theodore Kaczynski, that many people will also know as the Unabomber, serial killer, but also a extremely unique, to the point, and articulate anti-tech philosopher in his own right, primarily known for Industrial Society and Its Future, which is his manifesto, which was published in the 90s. Forcibly published in the New York Times in the 90s. And we're really talking today about his latest book called Anti-Tech Revolution, which was published in 2016, I think republished in 2020. So we sort of have these two volumes of his work at the moment, which is Technological Slavery, which I believe you helped edit and put together with, was it Feral House publisher?
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So which is the manifesto, a criticism of anarcho-primitivism and a few other letters. And then we have this sort of second volume now, Anti-Tech Revolution. So we're sort of focusing on that. But I mean, to begin, just to open up this conversation, in terms of people, people working with this stuff, you have sort of spent the most time actually in written conversation with Ted Kaczynski, since he was incarcerated.
Probably one of the most. I mean, I don't know if it's literally the most or the longest, but relatively detailed, high-level discussions for many years, going back to late 2003. I think was our first letter that we exchanged. At the time, I was newly hired lecturer in philosophy at the University of Michigan, which was Kaczynski's alma mater. And I was developing a course on philosophy of technology. I wanted to include his work, both the manifesto and then anything that had occurred since then. And it was pretty much a media blackout for many years after he was imprisoned in 1997. The media just kind of black holed him, and you didn't hear a thing about him. So I decided to write to him in 2003 to just find out what was going on, what he'd been writing. And it turned out he'd been doing quite a bit. He had a number of essays that he had written that were not published. He had some new thoughts on the manifesto. And he had some ideas that he wanted to circulate and to discuss. And I was willing to have a kind of a back and forth dialogue or debate with him, in a sense, because I was sympathetic to most of his points. But I knew that there were criticisms of his views. And so I, in many cases in my letters, I adopted sort of a critical stance, and I would sort of throw skeptical comments at him, so someone could say this about your idea, or what if someone came up with this counter proposal? What would you say? And that prompted a lot of discussion back and forth where he was actively defending his ideas against criticisms. And that was a lot of the bulk of our letters for the first 2 or 3 years, was really a kind of an elaboration of his ideas, a defense, and a response to critiques. And eventually that ended up being the book Technological Slavery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm intrigued. Has anything in your own life come of this correspondence? Have you had any knocks on the door?
Well, no, actually, I haven't. I mean, it's been a little bit surprising. I always kind of expected some sort of follow-up or contact, or, I don't know, right? If the FBI wants to have a chat, I'm I'm happy to do that. I was never really afraid of these guys because everything was on the up and up. I was a professor at Michigan. I was writing him letters about theory and philosophical ideas. And okay, there's nothing wrong with that. Prisoners have rights to communicate. I have a right to pursue interesting philosophical ideas. Philosophy of technology was one of my areas of expertise. So yeah, they had literally nothing to say. So I suspect that the authorities, well, maybe somewhere in the background, they have a file on me. I don't know. I'm guessing probably something like that exists, but nothing that I know of. No consequences at the university. None in my private life. Probably, like I say, the authority figures, they figure that it's best not to raise the attention level and the publicity because they know that's going to hurt them. Mm-hmm. So I think, and this holds true in many subjects, actually, the figures in power probably prefer to just not discuss you at all, not discuss things, not get you into the news, because then your ideas start to get discussed, and the best is just to ignore it. So I suppose, if anything, that was a kind of a strategy on their part. We'll just leave Skrbina alone. We'll let him write the letters to Kaczynski, and we'll just put up with his books, and there's nothing they can do about it anyway, and it can only hurt them if they decide to come after me. So yeah, I think that's where it was at.
Okay, I see. So were you aware of the manifesto on its original publication?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've been tracking the Unabomber story in the early '90s when it was starting to come out, and I was really fascinated by the little bits and pieces that would slip out into the news stories, and you could see that there was some intelligence there. There was kind of a real thought process going on. So yeah, I was really, really kind of fascinated in the whole story. I guess I never really thought the whole thing would see the light of day, and then suddenly, what was it? September 19, I think, 1995, and then suddenly, boom! Without any warning, boom! There it is. Washington Post full manifesto was published. I was really shocked and excited. And I remember I ran out that morning and grabbed a couple of copies of the newspaper, and I still have a copy today, and started typing it up, started putting it in processed form, because this was sort of almost like pre-internet. Nobody really had easy access to documents online. So I had to literally take a newsprint copy of the manifesto and just by hand, and my wife and we sat down and we typed up the whole darn manifesto just to get it in word process form. So yeah, that was quite an exciting moment, actually.
Okay. So in terms of your correspondence, have you ever, I don't want to do the sort of killer fanboy thing, which is quite common these days, with all these Netflix documentaries, but have you got an impression of what he's like as a person? Does that come through in the letters, or is it strictly theoretical, to the point anti-tech philosophy?
Well, yeah, our topics were always theoretical. I never asked him about his personal background. His family, his upbringing. I didn't really care about all that. This is what the documentaries want to talk about. I told them right up front, right at the very beginning, I had no real interest in those things, didn't really want to talk about them. I just wanted to talk about the question of technology. So that was really the entire focus of all of our letters. Even in that process, though, of course, little bits and pieces of the person's life come through. And, I was really always impressed. He was always very respectful, and he wrote very, lucid, rational letters on a routine basis, and very thoughtful, very, serious in his views, kind of, I guess I would say unrelenting in his position, but that's fine. He has a right to do that. And just a very respectful and rational correspondent. That's really how I found him to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, moving into the book, so this sort of made me smile when I reread Anti-Tech Revolution, because it had actually been a while since I'd read it. So what made me smile is, even from prison, and I guess he probably saw this back in the day as well, one of the first things that he mentions in the book is the fact that many anti-tech advocates basically keep reading and spouting anti-tech philosophy. They read Ellul, Zerzan, Illich, maybe even Heidegger, Edward Abbey, etc. All these thinkers, and there's more and more and more and more. And they keep reading these books and talking about them. And this for them has become sort of a form of of praxis. And basically, Kaczynski says, like, you know, this was bound to happen, and this has replaced actual action for them. And it makes it seem as if Kaczynski is stating that really none of these writers go far enough. Do you think that's what he's saying? And where do you think the line is for him where none of these other anti-tech thinkers are, you know, taking the leap which he thinks they should take?
Yeah. Well, you know, most, I'd say virtually all of Kaczynski's ideas exist in some form in earlier thinkers, earlier writers, which is fairly obvious. It's true for all of us. I mean, that's no surprise. So yeah, you do have harsh critics in people like Ellul, in his own weird way, Heidegger, you know, and then Illich and Lewis Mumford and so forth, and Herbert Marcuse. So I mean, these guys were all sort of technology critics. They had different angles on the problem. Some of them, you know, I mean, they were intellectuals, so they tended to write intellectual critiques. Well, okay, this is expected. They were generally speaking, not activists, so they weren't really interested in active policies, you know, against technology. Some of them did talk about the need for revolution. Ellul hinted at it a couple of times. Marcuse talked about that. Illich does. A couple lines in Lewis Mumford where he talks about the need to dismantle the mega machine. So, I mean, there's sort of those ideas are there, but they, of course, these thinkers are not sort of, you know, Marxist revolutionaries, so they're not going to really elaborate on how this could happen and the need for it. So they would just sort of describe the system, describe the evils of it, criticize it as thoroughly as they could, maybe say, look, there's a need to subvert the system in the end because there's no other alternative, and then they would leave it at that. So, you know, right, obviously Kaczynski's in a position where he can go further and stronger. He can really press the revolutionary case, whereas maybe they could not quite do it in their positions. So hard to know what they were really thinking. You know, were they sort of self-censoring because of their positions? We don't really know. And most, of course, most modern day critics are very, very tepid. They're just they want to deal with abstract ideas and sort of vague criticisms. And, you know, very few professors these days are really kind of true radicals. They don't really want to get into the messy activism piece because I don't know, it looks bad, or it's just, you know, too threatening to their status, and they're making good money and they don't want to jeopardize that. And, you know, probably their universities are getting money from tech companies and so forth, and they don't want to have any blowback from that. So, you know, it really takes an independent person with a sort of a strong moral backbone and no real ties that can be threatened to him or her to really take the strong view. So Kaczynski, of course, was in such a position. He was completely independent. He had no connections whatsoever, nothing to worry about, and he could write absolutely freely and as harshly as he chose to. So, I mean, it was a kind of a luxury of his position. I don't know that we should criticize these other big name critics. I mean, they sort of, you know, did as much as they could within their sphere of influence. You know, we always tend to look in hindsight and say, well, somebody should have pressed this point, and they should have made a stronger case for this. And yeah, maybe they should have in hindsight, but it's hard to jump back, you know, 20 or 30 or 50 years and say, well, why didn't so-and-so do this, you know? So, but yeah, you know, Kaczynski is, I mean, he's legitimately the harshest, most active critic of the system. So, I mean, anybody is going to take a less potent, less activist position than him, sort of by definition. And he could always criticize other people because he says, look, I've taken the strongest view possible. Everybody's less strong than me. Well, okay, so be it. I mean, somebody's going to be at the extreme limit, and it happens to be him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a fair point. I mean, also in terms of the, you know, lecturers not getting involved in the activism, that's sort of dealt with in the essay, The System's Neatest Trick, right? Also, this sort of double bind where they can't criticize the foundations that hold them up, right? So there's always a limit to,
Sure.
You know, postmodern deconstruction is like, yeah, we can deconstruct everything, but we can't deconstruct the education system itself because I still need a paycheck, right?
Exactly right. I mean, it really takes either a truly independent intellectual, right? Maybe I suppose theoretically somebody who's tenured should be able to write this, but usually you don't get tenure unless you've already proven yourself to be sort of a defender of the system. So, I mean, that's not much help. You almost have to really be kind of a renegade, independent thinker and willing to just, speak the hard truth and not really worry about those kind of connections. And it's a pretty rare thing in intellectual circles.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in terms of that sort of, praxis and practical element of his work, he does state that this book is a textbook. And why do you think this is so important for him to make it clear that this is a textbook and should be studied as such?
Well, yeah, I think he thinks of it as a kind of a manual, right, for would-be revolutionaries out there, to give them a firm basis, a firm footing, and some details, some guidelines, as he says, about how to deal with the system, things to avoid, problems that you want to avoid getting into, and maybe some strategic approaches and how you can go about tackling the system. So it's a kind of a guidebook or a primer, to call it a textbook. I don't know if he uses that exact word. I mean, that implies it's just a little bit of a field of study. For me, it's more of a manual, right? It's an action manual that's supposed to be used by people who really want to sort of be serious revolutionaries in some sense against the system.
Okay. I'm surprised it hasn't been banned. It's still on Amazon. But then I guess it isn't like what was the famous one in the 80s? The Anarchist Cookbook? Was that what it was called?
Oh yeah, Anarchist Cookbook. Yeah, exactly.
So it's not along those lines.
Yeah, so that's explicitly dealing with violence and bombs and violent tactics. So, but there's nothing like that in any of Kaczynski's writings. There's nothing in the manifesto, nothing in Technological Slavery, nothing in Anti-Tech Revolution that really talks about violence. Nothing that advocates violence. Nothing that talks about killing. Nothing that talks about bombs. I mean, it's really sort of an abstract, in that sense, kind of discussion about the nuts and bolts of how revolutionaries work against a larger social power that they're confronting. And he doesn't talk about the violent angle. I suppose maybe that was his sort of constraint, because he knows that he would be blocked from communicating any references to violence from the prison, because the prison system is, of course, screening everything that goes out. All of his letters, any manuscripts, are being pre-read and screened to make sure that they don't cross any of these boundaries about advocacy of violence and killing and so forth. So, I mean, it's not his doing. It's almost by definition, that's their little bit of censorship that they are able to exert. But what he writes is, of course, just the ideas, the intellectual history, the theory, and he does really a remarkably good job at that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, I feel sort of a strange obligation, I guess, to address them, because as you've put it there, that in all of his writing there isn't violence, there isn't here you should go out and bomb, or you should there's nothing like this. And then there's not even, which is found in some other writers' work, there's not even a push to say vandalism or destruction, not that I can recall. Now, I don't want to cheapen what happened, but it almost seems then in that sense as an almost Jekyll and Hyde situation, where there's this completely rational, systematic writing and theorizing of the theory itself, and saying, look, here's the state we're in. And then all of a sudden there's this burst of complete irrationality in the frame of these murders. They don't really fit the crime doesn't fit the theory in a sense. And I guess, do you think maybe they've been tethered together, even though actually if you were to read the theory, if to read the manifesto, to read Anti-Tech Revolution, there's nothing in there that says that this should be done?
Yeah. Well, Kaczynski's bombings, I think he has always viewed as a unique situation, right? So they weren't necessarily revolutionary per se, but they were a means to gain the notoriety and the leverage that would allow him to really publish the manifesto in a high visibility venue. So I think he viewed it as a unique situation at his time and his place. Did not, like I say, didn't directly serve this revolutionary purpose, but was more of a leverage tool to get the message out in the biggest possible way. I mean, of course, there's that example. And that example exists out there, and I guess in theory, other people could follow that same example. But like we said, he never advocated it. He never suggested it. I guess he never really found it necessary to do that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in the history of revolutionary thinking, but I mean, even going back to people like Marx, I don't think Marx ever said, get out there and start slitting throats, or start, shooting people. I mean, they don't talk that way, right? They're just saying, hey, we're being oppressed by the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat need to arise and take control. And okay, well, there's different ways to do that. And I guess different people interpret that differently. So I think this is just maybe one more in that long established history of revolutionary thinking. And, each person sort of comes to the situation with unique circumstances and unique history and unique motivations. And, I think it's kind of left to each individual to decide what these ideas mean and what if anything they can do about them.
Okay. Well, drawing on the comment with Marxism there, I mean, you bring forward a good point, really, that Ted himself sort of brings about, which is that, and perhaps I'm a pessimistic reader of this book, because many of these questions I realize revolve around the same point for Kaczynski, which is that he has a philosophy of human agency in relation to technology, which he really removes a lot of it. In terms of Marxism, he's just saying, look, the air of Marxism was in the atmosphere. If Marx wasn't around, someone else would have filled that place. And in the same sense, he also talks about how we look to a president or a prime minister, but really they're just this sort of symbol for a false security. And actually, there is no such thing as this, like, oh, we go to this person and they just sort everything out. Really, what we're talking about, I guess, in vague terms, is sort of the fact that power is just in the atmosphere, and we can never really find a way to actually utilize it for our own betterment. And I guess one, would you agree that that's sort of the correct reading, that we can never really get a grasp on power in Kaczynski's terms? But also, is there a way out of that to be able to actually change things?
Well, I think the idea is that systems, large, complex technological systems, seem to have a momentum and a kind of inertia of their own. And just by the nature of their structure and their functioning and the energy involved in these systems, they function in very necessary ways, sort of independently of any one little element, even a leading element, even a president or a prime minister or a CEO. Large corporations, large institutions have this kind of structural momentum, and in fact they're designed that way, right? I mean, they can't really function if you lose one person or two people, even the top people. The system has to go on; it has to keep functioning, and we just eventually replace that person with someone else, and then we carry on. So, large technological systems seem to have this characteristic of this self-guiding, self-motivating structure that drives them forward consistently with, let's say, technological or system-wide imperatives that they sort of are compelled to follow. And I think this is partly why individual people are relatively impotent when it comes to guiding these systems. You want to blame the president or the prime minister for things that go wrong. Well, look, it's a structural problem in this large and vast system, and even one important person can't really do anything to significantly change the system. It's just the structure of an advanced technological institution. And that's both for good and bad. I mean, that the system can carry on and it's not perturbed by loss of individual people, but if it's doing harm, if it's causing damage, then we have a very hard time stopping this thing or controlling it just by those same rules. So it's hard for people to claim real control over the system. It's hard for would-be revolutionaries to disrupt the system, again, for that very reason. It's a very dispersed, decentralized kind of structure that has this very amorphous nature. And there's problems on both sides of the coin, really trying to grapple with this thing, whether you're opposing it or you're supporting it, you're trying to steer it. one of the chapters, the first chapter of Anti-Tech Revolution, is kind of how we really don't have the ability to control these institutions. We can't control the progress of society. These things are basically beyond our rational control, and that actually bodes ill. That pushes one towards the most extreme solutions, because the normal ones, the so-called rational ones of just tweaking or trying to steer the system, just don't seem to work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, what would Kaczynski make? Because you often get this debate between individual agency and corporate agency. So people would say, well, look at Amazon's carbon footprint. We need to do something about this. And I'm actually, I'll put some skin in the game here and say I'm far more on the side of, well, who is it who's buying things from Amazon, right? It is the individual consumers. So what would Kaczynski make of that argument that actually, to have this sort of revolutionary overhaul, you really do need I would say you need to reduce the idea that we need to consume so much? Or would Kaczynski say that, well, that desire is sort of brought about from Amazon itself, sort of thing?
Yeah, right. Well, so, I mean, in theory, sure, right? Amazon has millions of customers, and if all those millions of customers somehow got together and decided, hey, it's a good thing, we're going to, stop buying from Amazon or whatever, right? I suppose, or threatened Amazon, hey, we want you to print only, whatever, recycled paper. I don't know what you might want. In theory, of course, you could do that. But practically speaking, it would take such a huge counter-organization. How are you going to get millions of disparate customers together and coordinating, discussing, and agreeing on something and taking action in a coordinated way? Yeah, it's almost impossible. It would take an Amazon-sized counter-organization to confront the Amazon organization itself. Mm-hmm. So this is almost impossible, right? So this is kind of the practical matter of dealing with these sort of issues, that they're so complex that they're beyond the means of any sort of, like I say, rational ideological sort of control or coercion or whatever you might want to do with them. So that's what keeps driving Kaczynski's argument again and again. He always drives you back to you cannot rationally control these things. The best you can hope for is to try to pull the plug on these guys. Just undercut them from the base, drive them into collapse, heighten the stress on them. And that can be done by a relatively small group of people, probably. It doesn't take millions of customers to if you can get to the base of a technological system or something like this, maybe it can be done with a smaller number of people. It doesn't take, like I say, lots of people to kind of get together and deliberately come to some conclusion about how they want to respond. So I think that's kind of the general thrust, right? Where there's really just these large systems, there's no way to counter them. So just work on heightening the stress, pull the rug out from under them, and make it as hard as possible for them to carry on, really.
Okay. But the problem is, though, I guess, is that capitalism is extremely liquid, right? It can pretty much subsume anything into it and say, this is now capitalism. You weren't ready for that. It hasn't met anything yet. So how would Kaczynski? Because what I'm saying is the irony of anti-capitalism is that the stress which is against capitalism can never really be a form of consumption, right? You can't be like, right, we're going to push capitalism.
Outconsume.
Yeah, exactly. You can't do it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, right. So it has to be, right, in the case of capitalism, some kind of anti-consumption movement, right, which is just saying, stop consuming things. Or there's other ways. You could sort of, wreak havoc in a financial system with the financial markets. I mean, there's been things in the stock market where relatively small groups of investors were, causing local chaos in the systems, and they had to implement new policies to try to block these guys. But you're right. I mean, both capitalism and technology are really robust systems that can really incorporate a lot of resistance against them and compromise that resistance. Mm-hmm. So you really have to, and Kaczynski is good at emphasizing this, you really have to tackle these systems in areas where they cannot compromise, where there's just no way that they can sort of give ground. It's the basic elements. It's the communication infrastructure. It's the power grid. It's basic. Technological modes. Maybe it's medical genetic technology, which somehow seems to be essential to the future of the system. You really got to got to focus on these kind of uncompromisable points and really kind of press home on those. And at the same time, you really, I mean, in a sense, it's a little bit of a waiting game too. And he's emphasized this as well, that, all revolutionary movements really have to bide their time. They can't just sort of up and decide and just, get the pitchforks and the flaming torches and just bring the system down. It just doesn't work that way. You have to sort of organize, get yourself together, get a focus. And then there's just a lot of biding of your time until sort of the time is right. And it's hard to know when that will be and what are the signals for that. You never really know. But Kaczynski has been more than once. He's stated this idea that revolutionary action really on its own can't really do anything. The system is just too robust it can fend off or incorporate or compromise any near-term threats to it. There has to be these larger structural problems that are really confronting the system from the outside, so to speak, and then maybe a revolutionary movement from the inside can kind of hit with a double-pronged attack, and then maybe that would be the most effective means for action. So in our case, we're really sort of waiting for capitalism to burn itself out, either by consuming the resources of the planet or producing so much waste that we all start kind of drowning in our toxic byproducts, or waiting for, global ecosystem collapse or the food supply to go down. I mean, there's lots of nightmare scenarios, right, in the environment that could happen in the next few decades that would really put huge stresses on the system, and it may be closer to some kind of breakdown than we realize. I think it's very hard to see how close the system is, and you keep getting feeling like there's these little tremors that are coming through, whether it's financial shocks or it's pandemics or these little sort of tremors that are coming through, like the system isn't very good against some of these more fundamental challenges, and it might not take much to just kind of push that baby right over. And once those dominoes start falling, it's like, get out of the way, because it's going down, it's going fast. So yeah.
No. I'm in complete agreement, and I'm also in agreement with the idea that there is tiny things that the system at the moment just can't seem to really deal with, even though capitalism has its ways of capitalism is a master at biding time, and because it's a master of credit, right? It's a master of creating things where there actually isn't anything, so it can just hold up things with nothing. But as you say, I'm in full agreement, sort of, with the Linkola view that the collapse of the system will be something which we really have never thought about. I mean, he thought that the collapse of biological life would be, the death of a certain algae in water would just collapse an entire ecosystem. These tiny things which you just don't think about, and you go, well, that's not there anymore, so we're just completely ruined. But But the one thing I would say in terms of this idea of revolution, if you take the French Revolution or if you take the Marxist Revolution, they were fighting for something which I would say isn't as big of an existential risk as what we have now, right? So they were like, if their revolution fails, well, they're back to bourgeoisie rule, or they're back to monarchical rule. If we don't act fast, we're on course, if you're in agreement with climate change, or if you are or not, whatever. If you are in agreement with that, however, which I believe, Kaczynski very, very much is, our risk is the death of potentially billions of people, right? So it's not like if we fail, well, back to having a king and maybe some of us get beheaded. It's the complete death of the planet.
Exactly. The stakes are much higher, right? I mean, it's a whole new ballgame. We've never really faced this before. We have no evolutionary history, no social political history to deal with what we're facing now. It's a utterly unique situation, which really puts us in a bind, because we don't know the markers, we don't know the signs, we don't have the examples in history to really look from. We can look at collapse of the Roman Empire, or vaguely sort of similar things. But like you say, it seems like the stakes are really much higher this time. So in a sense, that supports the revolutionary cause, right? Because if people get the idea that if we don't succeed, we die, well, that's a pretty motivated revolutionary, right? I mean, you're going to just get out there and you're going to say, to hell with it. I'm just going to take whatever action I have to, because if I'm going to die otherwise, I got nothing to lose. And we can well imagine if some next mega killer pandemic comes rolling around in a year or two, and which it could easily happen. And I mean, you're like literally millions and millions of people are dying, and people feel like, hey, this is like the end of the world. Then people will just probably take more extreme action against the system. So it's not hard to imagine these kind of things happening in the relatively near future.
Well, I'm not sure we need to imagine them. I heard something the other day, which I remember thinking back when I was younger, I think this is going to happen in our lifetime, which is now in the UK, 1 in 5 people is completely antibiotic resistant. Antibiotics just don't work anymore for 1 in 5 people, right? So that's like, okay, something comes along, guess what? You're dead. It's like
you're dead.
We used them too often, and that's how it is. But the funny thing is that same narrative is happening time and time again, and yet we still believe we can eat our cake and have it too, right? We were told, look, if we keep, and even the scientists knew, the doctors knew, and they told everyone, and yet they kept giving them out, right? So if we take that narrative of, look, we knew in the 80s, if we keep using antibiotics at the rate we are, there's going to be a resistance. And yet what did we do? We kept using antibiotics, and now we're facing up to what we knew was going to happen all along. The same thing is exactly happening with the planet, right? It's like basically being on a train and going, look, if you don't pull the brakes, we're going to crash into that thing. And it's not like we can't see the thing, and it's not like we don't know it's there, right? We all know it's there. So that would be my question to you from a Kaczynskian point of view. Why do we, is it just the complex systems? Why do we refuse to pull the brake? Is it the complex systems thing again that within complex systems, responsibility is just lost?
Yeah, I don't think we've really hit those wake up calls yet. I mean, we sort of know it's coming. I mean, antibiotic resistance is probably there for large groups of people, but it's not leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. At least not that I know, right?
Yeah.
Right now, it's a relatively small number. Okay, the occasional person who goes in for surgery in the hospital and then gets some bug and he can't get rid of it and he dies. Okay, well, that's still a relatively small number. So. It's even with the pandemic, right? I mean, we hear these stats about cases and death rates, and but still, it's peanuts really when you compare it to population sizes and population growth. It's going to take something I think far more shocking and far more tangible before people really decide we're going to hit the brakes. It's the old image like from the Black Death, where they're rolling every third body you're rolling out to the street and you're just leaving it in the street because you can't. I mean, it's going to take that level of death to really kind of shock people into thinking, look, if we don't act now, it's going to be 100% of the bodies are out in the streets and that's it. We're all gone. So, but we just really haven't quite. We've been able to rationalize our way around it. We haven't really quite seen the real catastrophe that we're facing, and I think it's just a matter of time. Personally,
do you personally have any predictions of what that first thing or things may be?
Yeah, well, it's really hard in a really dynamic system. I mean, there's generally speaking, you have environmental catastrophes and you have technological catastrophes. So. You've got two spheres of crisis modes that we're worried about. So it could be some kind of ecosystem collapse. It could be food supply collapse. It could be, rapid climate change issues. On the climate side, it could be, I guess in principle, pandemic could either be an environmental or it could be a technological issue if we decide it's an engineered virus that somebody created in the lab somewhere. And there's several technological disaster scenarios from, things that we would normally call terrorism or biotech things run amok to, killer drones that decide they're going to be semi-autonomous, just going to go around killing things randomly or, they're self-replicating. They're building robots that can reproduce themselves. They're creating these agile, running, jumping robots that can kind of move like humans. It's really shocking when you see these videos of what these things can do. It doesn't take, there's a few more pieces of the puzzle that have to come together, and that could happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And then, then just the number of nightmare scenarios multiplies, rapidly. And it only takes one of those, one really catastrophic scenario has to get triggered and then we're getting sucked down the hole. So even though you could say any one, that one's unlikely and this could probably be stopped. And if that happened, we would just do this. But when there's so many serious problems coming both from the environment side and from the technological side, it's just like, it's like impossible. Like how we can't possibly dodge all these bullets. You might dodge one or two, but there's 10 or 20 or 30 more coming your way, and there's going to be hell to pay. I don't know how else to put it. So
no. Yeah, I mean, I'm in complete agreement with you. I think perhaps one thing that's underneath all of those, though, is a learned helplessness, a learned incompetence, right? Is that only, let's say, post-war, 60, 70 years ago, I think if there was a food supply shortage or if there was many of these problems, people were internally flexible enough to not just constantly adhere to a form of life that they considered normal, right? They'd be like, right, well, we need to go out and, not to sound too traditional and ye oldie, but like, we need to go out and we're going to have nettle soup and we're going to hunt rabbits. Like, that's what we need to do for food now, right? Or,
sure,
all right,
yeah.
Well, we had a nice garden. We need to dig it up now for an allotment because bad times are coming. Whereas now,
sure.
I think you'd find, just to take it as a metaphor, I think you'd quite literally find people who would refuse to dig up their garden to plant an allotment because that's just not normal, right? That's not modern life. And I think that might be something we face, is that people could survive, but they'll just be so enamored in quote unquote normal life, they just won't budge.
Yeah, well, right. There's no doubt that a large percentage, probably majority of people, either will be unwilling or unable to adapt to some kind of crisis. They'll just tough it out and they'll just think, well, it'll blow over and I'm going to stand my ground, and they won't even be able to conceive that. And then, okay, then maybe those people are going down. I don't know what to say. They may be the first ones to bite the dust. And there always will be some who do know how to get out of the system and survive, and remember how to do some basic farming or basic hunting, and kind of can survive in a small scale community. I mean, even here in Michigan, I'm in the Metro Detroit area, so it's it's a big modern sort of suburban area, but we're only a couple hours drive from pretty fertile farmland where people more or less can survive, could grow their own food. There's plenty of water up northern Michigan, so there's people here who would have options, and they would be able to get out and somehow, presumably, would be able to survive a pretty harsh condition. Now, there are some scenarios where nobody's able to survive. If it's really kind of a global, you don't really know, right? Some kind of who knows, right? Like a radioactive, nuclear war scenario or something that blankets the globe. Well, everybody dies. It doesn't matter what. So there are some really horrible ones where nobody's going to get out. And there's some where, the people who do manage to get back to a simpler form of life and can acquire the land and the resources to keep themselves alive, there will probably be a core of humanity that will be able to tough it out and will relearn, because we all knew how to do this at one time. We'll relearn how to survive, and there will be a core of people who will survive into the future.
Mm-hmm. And then in 100 years' time, they'll have their own stock market and start it all again.
Well, that's what people will say, right? They'll say, well, look, why do we bring this down? They're just going to rebuild it if the system collapses, right? This is a kind of an argument against revolting. But actually, that won't work, because the whole modern system was built on fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's built on easy access to those fuels. So we had coal and oil that was literally at the surface of the earth, just to dig it up or scrape it up or scoop it up in buckets, right? Mm-hmm. And now all of that is gone. That's completely gone. So when the system sort of starts unraveling and collapses down, we have no more easy access. It takes huge amounts of energy to get to those fossil fuels today. And when you don't have the energy supplies to get to your energy supplies, your system is going to spiral out of control, and it's just going to go down, and you won't be able to get to it for thousands of years. I don't know how. I mean, it's like so long you don't even have to worry about that one, because you're never going to get back to that level. You can forget about rebuilding the internet or any steam engines. Oh, forget it. That's impossible. You'll be burning wood. You'll have wood stoves and animal power, and good luck with that. That'll be the extent of it for a long time, right?
Yeah, and then people say, well, We'll think of something, or we'll build alternative energy. And of course, to build an alternative energy system which meets one-on-one at the moment, our petroleum system, is to basically, we need a lot of petroleum to be able to do that, which we no longer have anymore, right? So like if we were super sensible, rational, all of a sudden tomorrow every single human is as hyper rational as can be, you go, right, we need to use every last bit of petroleum to build an alternative system. But we're not doing that, so it's not going to happen, right? But But there you go. But there's a question, okay? So everyone's, we've been doomsaying this whole time, but of course we haven't spoken about the utopian God which is coming, which is green energy, sustainable energy, right? That's just going to save everything, yeah?
Sure, that's the techno-optimist view, right? Well, we're going to have some wait for some great breakthroughs. Maybe it's super efficient solar cells, or maybe it's some nice nuclear fusion thing, which we've been talking about for about 40 years. That that's going to be like clean nuclear power, or whatever. Right? There's always that sort of that just over the horizon kind of thing that's going to come along and save us, and even those things. I mean, those aren't going to work because probably they're not going to materialize, or if they will, they'll be accompanied by lots of negative side effects. And of course, even those things are intended to power a system which in some sense is really unsustainable and uncontrollable. So, primitive societies have no need for super efficient solar cells because you're not really using electricity or using it at all, right? So a lot of this is on a premise of a self-sustaining, self-functioning system. And, if like I say, if any time in the next 100 years, this fossil fuel cycle starts to unravel, solar power and all these things that isn't going to do you a damn bit of good, because it's not going to be sufficient to really sustain the system in any form that we think of it today.
What about space? We're just going to fly to space. That's the latest one, right? Fly to space and we'll be fine.
Sure, yeah, whatever, right? Go to the moon or go to Mars or something, yeah. Right? Yeah. Yeah, okay, right.
Is it worth your time expelling this ridiculous notion, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just that's fun to talk about, and it makes nice movies and these kind of things. But I mean, I don't know. We're so far from proving that you can do that you can really survive on the moon or on Mars. I suppose in principle, if we could hang on for another 20, 30 years, we might be able to get people out there, and then they might be able to establish some self-sustaining system where you're using the energy locally to grow things. That really would have to be a self-sustaining system. You can't rely on inputs from the earth or whatever to keep you going. That's like cheating, right? So I suppose, and there's you can imagine some scenarios where small groupings of people could survive in a semi-sustainable way. But yeah, I mean, there's so many unknowns. There's so many question marks about whether that's even possible, how long it would take, and we're going to have accelerating problems here on Earth, which will make that less and less feasible. I don't care what Elon Musk says. He's going to have a mighty hard time launching rockets when the system is imploding all around him. So, I don't think we need to worry about that one too much.
Sounds like a horror movie, though, doesn't it? They finally get to space, and then everyone on Earth just dies, and they're just stuck.
Yeah, there you go. Right? Yeah, we made it. Now, okay, now here we are, all alone out in space. Yeah. Yeah, it's like this is what Superman or Krypton, right? You're escaping your planet as your planet blows up, and then there you go. You hope you survive, but yeah, good luck to that one. So.
Okay. There is one question I do really want to get in here, because when I spoke to a Jacques Ellul scholar, we mentioned Ted Kaczynski, because he sort of said, well, actually, some of the re-interest in Ellul is because of there's been a big interest in Kaczynski, and he said, a lot of people come to Ellul's work, specifically Technological Society, because they've seen it cited by Kaczynski, and he sort of made clear to me that Ellul's work really is completely split down the middle. You have the anti-tech critique on one side, and you have the religious side. And he said to take one side on its own is just to basically enter into a biased Ellul, and this is what Kaczynski did. He took one side of Ellul without the other, and that's why the conclusions for Kaczynski happened, because he didn't take the other side. And it's interesting, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why Kaczynski specifically takes up Christianity near the end of, I think it's almost as an appendix in Anti-Tech Revolution, he takes up Christianity. And firstly, what do you make of the statement there regarding Kaczynski's sort of biased reading of Ellul?
Well, it's an interesting question. I guess, I've been reading and teaching Ellul for many years myself, so I know quite a bit about his technological work. I know less about his religious or theological work. My view, they were relatively distinct areas of writing and thinking. So, I mean, you read Ellul's Technological Society, and there's a few little references to God and religion there, but it's really an entirely secular kind of work. and to me, just, I mean, without sort of going into, I have to do more detailed research to kind of flesh it out. But, the thought is all those arguments stand on their own. It doesn't require a Christian view or an anti-Christian view. I think all the critiques and the analysis of technology really is an independent self-standing kind of argument in Ellul. So I would tend to disagree with this fellow that I don't see where you need or require the Christian thinking, the theological angle. If anything, that tends to water down revolutionary action, because Christians are somehow, have this sort of misguided optimism, either that God's going to step in and save everybody when it gets too bad, or, well, in any case, you die and you go to heaven. So, well, what's the heck? It's not such a big deal because I still get to go see God. So, they sort of have this little kind of fairy tale, happy ending story if you're a Christian, and you don't get too worked up about, the fate of the earth. And in some weird ways, you actually want to see the earth go down, because that's sort of the end of times, end of days or something. And now Jesus is coming back, or whatever crazy thing you happen to think. So, Ellul was not like that. Like I say, he was more of a kind of a renegade theologian. Kaczynski, like I say, had never really talked much about Christianity. I don't recall the details of what he said at the end of Anti-Tech Revolution. I would say, I don't know. I would treat those relatively distinct. I think they're relatively separate arguments. It's a different kind of an argument if you're talking to someone who's really invested in Christian theology. Like I say, they view things in kind of this eschatological form, where they're making assumptions about where the world is heading and the afterlife and so forth. So it's a different kind of discussion. But, I don't think the basic critique of technology is affected.
Okay. So Kaczynski is, I got the impression that he is, but he doesn't really state it outright. He's an atheist?
Yeah, he never really says. He presumably he's a kind of a, rational secularist. He's talked little funny things about, spirits in nature, and a little bit kind of, whimsical sort of things in a couple of interviews. And okay, maybe he's being serious, maybe he's just being funny, but nothing that I've seen. Nothing. I guess I would assume, yeah, he's basically kind of a secular, either agnostic or maybe an atheist in some sense, and he's certainly not using that as part of his analysis or his critique.
Okay. So what do you think people get wrong about Kaczynski's work? Where do you think do you think there's a clear path where you just think people come to the wrong conclusions about it? Well,
they put way too much emphasis on the crimes and the victims, and they don't take the trouble to look at the actual arguments, the actual anti-tech argument. And it's partly their fault, because probably people are a little bit lazy. It's partly the fault of the media, because the media loves to talk about the sensationalistic aspects of Kaczynski and sort of demonize him and talk about, sort of his background and his history, and act like he's some kind of crazed killer or something. And, so the media does its usual fine job of biasing people against somebody that they don't like. And so it takes a lot of sort of independent work, where people have to kind of dig into it themselves. They have to actually buy Kaczynski's book or one of his books and actually read it and think about it and follow up on some of the sources and check some of his footnotes, and, maybe get a hold of Ellul's book or something by Mumford or Illich, and, spend a little time reading those to try to really get sort of the complete picture. I tried to spell these out in a couple of my books. So I did one book that was called Confronting Technology, which was kind of an anthology of technical critiques over time, over history. And I built up the history going back to the ancient Greeks, showing that there was a long series of thinkers, major thinkers, who were skeptical or critical of technology. And that's sort of a nice sort of starting point, where people really can sort of take the history seriously. It's not just a recent thing. It's not just some lone crackpot guy who's got some crazy ideas. There's a very long, very skeptical history of technology. So that's one piece. Then I did my own book, Metaphysics of Technology, which tried to spell out a kind of philosophy or metaphysical view of why technology seems to be so powerful. And I tried to sort of flesh that out in kind of a rational philosophical sort of way. So I mean, there are books and readings people have to do a little bit of work to kind of get to them, because you're not going to get these things in the mainstream media. So, I guess if there's sort of a plea out there, right, it's to sort of take the ideas seriously. Go to the core text. Go to Kaczynski's book. Read the actual manifesto. Read his couple of books. Maybe take a look at my books. Maybe read Alul's book. And then you really start to get a real appreciation for what's going on and how serious the problem is that we're all facing here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the media struggles as well, because, of course, they want to demonize him as a madman, but then equally in the same breath, they're reluctant to admit to the time that he spent with Henry Murray, right? Which I think, I know Kaczynski himself has said that didn't infect him, but I mean, that's a tough one to sort of say whether or not is he lying there, or is he, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, his days in Harvard there as an undergrad.
With the strange. I mean, I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but I mean, I'm fairly sure now it's known that it was MK Ultra.
Yeah, that's what they're saying, or it's indirectly, it's people who are connected to that. I don't think it was part of it, but yeah, that whole thing is really overblown. I mean, it was really sort of minor experiments. They were stressing, individual undergrads to kind of see how they reacted to personal stress on ideas that they personally held important. And I mean, it was really, really very mild, really very inconsequential. I've seen some of the transcripts of the actual dialogue between Kaczynski and his interrogators. So, I mean, it's a really convenient story to kind of pin the blame on the CIA or some evil lunatics who really warped his mind or something. But that's important, right? That's part of the media story. They want to show that somehow this guy has a warped mind, and that's why he did what he did. Not that he had good ideas, not that he was right about things. They don't want anybody to think that. They want to show that this is a warped, damaged individual, and that's why he did what he did. And they really jump through hoops to try to convince people that there was, he was damaged. He was, had an illness when he was 2 and his mom dropped him on his head, and, everything they can think of to explain why this guy is so damaged, rather than just saying, well, shoot, he was a smart guy. He got ideas. He drew from Alul and other thinkers, and he came to logical conclusions. They just don't want to deal with the arguments on face value. So they'll come up with every story under the sun to try to discredit the man rather than the ideas.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yep.
I mean, just out of interest, is Diogenes the first in the long line of anti-tech philosophers?
Diogenes?
He was the first one. He he had a cup, didn't he? And then he saw the boy cup his hands, so he threw his cup away because he didn't need it.
Yeah, because I don't know. I didn't talk about him in my book. Okay. I go back to, even Plato and Socrates. They were critical of the technologies of their day. Lao Tzu and some of the early Taoist thinkers were critical of their simple technologies of the day. So, I mean, it really goes back to 400 or 500 BC, both East and West, where prominent thinkers were really skeptical of even the very simple technologies. That's what's so striking. You see these guys criticizing technologies, and it's like nothing. It's like you say, it's a cup, or it's a pen, and it's a pencil, or it's really simple things. And you're like, oh my God, that's like so simple, and yet they can see that somehow there's a problem with this thing, and it's not good, and it's heading in the wrong direction. They could see it back then. It's really remarkable what some of these older thinkers have said. It's really a striking story.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the classic case of Ned Ludd, right? I mean, where Luddite comes from is, I mean, you think he would be taking on like a factory or something, but it was just was it a loom? It was like two looms, I think he broke.
Stocking loom, right? It was a machine that made stockings, and the guys who hand-knitted stockings didn't want the machine making the stockings. So they're like, what the hell? We're going to go bust these things up. So they just broke in and smashed the machines, like literally, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's a simple little thing. As today we would laugh at these little mechanical looms that were making stockings. But at the time, that was the threat, and the guys took action, and then some of them paid with their lives. I mean, it's really, really striking what has happened in the past, and it really gives you a feel for what could happen in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you'd like to add about anti-tech revolution that you feel we've missed?
No, it's a serious academic book. It's maybe in some ways not as accessible as Kaczynski's first book, Technological Slavery. But it's a serious work. It's well documented. It's well cited. for people who are motivated to kind of look into it and really want to kind of get that next level of thinking from Kaczynski, it's a perfect kind of a book for people to go into. It's not, I would say it's not light reading, so you need to sort of, be prepared to sort of, give it its due and kind of press ahead, with due moderation and sort of, get what you can from it. There's more stuff coming, right? As far as we know, he's working on a volume 2 of Technological Slavery. And we think that will be out in a year or so. So there'll be some kind of follow-up response, maybe to some of the stuff that's in Anti-Tech Revolution. I'm actually not really sure. I don't really know what's going to be in the volume 2. But I think things will come out before terribly long, a year, maybe 2 years at most. So it would be good if people are curious to read the first 2 books, just so they know the background and they have the context, and then be looking ahead to future things that will be coming out.
Well, do you think you'll get back in contact with him around the time, or is that era sort of over for you?
Yeah, I have not been in contact with him for 4 or 5 years now. It's that phase seems to be over. He's been mostly corresponding with a couple of personal assistants and his publisher. For the last couple of years, he's had severe limitations on his ability to send mail because of trivial postage problems and silly things that the prison has been doing to disrupt his ability to communicate. So he's really been forced to limit his communications to the very essential people. So he's dealing with his publisher, his lawyer, 1 or 2 people who are acting kind of as personal assistants, and so that's really about it. So we think and hope the situation will be better in the future. Maybe there'll be some occasion for me to contact him again. I have no problem with that. I'd be happy to do so. If something comes up that's relevant, I may send him a letter, and I've done this just in the past to inform him about things in the news, maybe that he's not aware of. So yeah, you never know. You never know what will come up in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. It seems like a good place to finish up. David Skrbina, thanks very much.
Yeah, James, thank you. Thanks for having me on again.